Then Jeff turned to the man who had brought Peter from the cafe and asked, "Why did you bring Peter here?" "Well, boss," the man replied, "he said he was a friend of yours, but I thought he was from the police." "Well, you're wrong," said Jeff. "Peter is a friend of mine, and I hope you didn't hurt him." Peter smiled because he was pleased that Jeff remembered him. "Okay," said Jeff. "All of you get out. I want to talk to my old friend, Peter." The others left the room, and Peter and Jeff were alone. "Well, Jeff," said Peter, sitting down, "you haven't changed much." "Perhaps not," replied Jeff, "but I'm much richer now. I own this club." Peter grinned. "So you've stopped stealing and started working honestly?" Jeff laughed. "Well, not exactly. You could say that I control the people who do the stealing. I sell the things which they steal. The club makes it very easy for me to do this because lots of people come here every day." "Anyway," Peter said, "I didn't come here for lessons about being a successful criminal. I need your help." "Why?" asked Jeff. Peter told Jeff the whole story, that Peter had given John a lift, that the police thought that John had killed his uncle, but that John said that he hadn't killed him. "I don't think John did kill his uncle," Peter continued, "but how can we prove it?" "There is only one way," replied Jeff. "You'll have to find the murderer." "But I don't know how to start." "Have you heard anyone talking about the murder?" Peter asked. "No," answered Jeff. "But if you can wait for a few minutes, I'll go and ask some of my friends if they know anything about it. Make yourself at home while you are waiting." After Jeff had left, Peter got up and went out into the hall. He looked into the big room where the music was coming from. A man was singing, some girls were dancing, and people were talking and laughing. It was quite dark and very hot. Peter felt thirsty. He asked for a drink and a waiter brought it. Peter tried to pay for the drink, but the waiter refused to take the money. "You're a friend of Jeff's," the waiter said, "so you don't have to pay." 10 minutes later, Jeff came back. "Well," he said as he sat down, "I think I have some useful information." Peter nodded. "What is it?" he asked. "Do you know who the murderer is?" Jeff laughed. "Of course not," he said. "But I can give you the name of someone in Bristol who may be able to help you." "What's his name?" Peter asked. "Bob Steele. He's a friend of mine. Bob lives by the river. He knows more about what happens in Bristol than the police do." "Thank you very much," said Peter. Jeff gave Peter a piece of paper. "Here's Bob's address," he said, "and a note to say that you're a friend of mine. Bob will help you find the murderer." Peter stood up. "Thank you again, but I must go now," he said to Jeff. "I must get back to Bristol as soon as possible." "Right," replied Jeff. "It was nice to see you again, and if you ever want another job, come and see me." "No, thank you," said Peter with a laugh. "I don't think I'd be a very good thief." Jeff walked out to the door with Peter and told the man at the door to drive Peter back to his lorry in the big car. Peter got in. It was the interval. John turned to Susan and said, "I'm very thirsty. Would you like a cola?" "Yes, please," she replied. John stood up. "Stay here," he said, "and I'll go and get you one." John walked to the end of the row of seats where they were sitting and up to the girl who was selling drinks and ice creams. "Yes, what do you want?" asked the girl with a smile. "2 colas, please," replied John. "There you are. That's £1.20, please," the girl said. John gave the money to the girl and started to walk back to Susan. Then he stopped. He could see that Susan was talking to another boy. She was arguing with him. The boy seemed very angry. John heard Susan say to the boy, "It's your own fault. You were late. Now go away and leave me alone." The boy didn't reply. He turned around and walked towards John. The boy bumped into John. knocking one of the bottles of cola on the ground. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" said John angrily. "You had better leave my girl alone," answered the boy, "or I'll do more than just push you." John picked up the bottle from the floor and went back to Susan. "Who was that?" John asked Susan. "It was my boyfriend, Steve," Susan replied. "He's angry with me because I didn't wait for him outside the cinema." "What did your boyfriend say?" John asked as he passed Susan one of the bottles. Susan had a drink. "Steve told me to come and sit with him," she said. John nodded. "And what did you say?" he asked. "I told Steve to go away and leave us alone. I told Steve that I was a free person and didn't belong to him. I said that he didn't own me and that I can do what I like. And anyway," she added, "I like you much more than him." John smiled. "I certainly like you much more than I like Steve," he said. Just then, the lights went out and the film started again. John put his arm around Susan. "Give me a kiss," he whispered to her. She did. "Please be careful," she whispered suddenly. "If Steve sees us, he'll be very angry." John looked around just in time to see Steve walking out of the door at the back of the cinema. "It's all right," said John. "Steve has just left." Time passed very quickly for John and Susan, and soon the film finished and the lights came on. "Look," John said as they waited to leave the cinema. "I can't explain now, but I've got to go back to Bristol. If you give me your address, I'll write to you." When they got outside, Susan opened her bag, wrote down her address, and gave it to John. While she was writing, John looked at his watch. It was 10:15, but he had promised to meet Peter at 10 o'clock. "I must go now, Susan," John said. "I'll write to you." "Goodbye," Susan said, "and take care of yourself." John gave her a quick kiss and started to walk back to the shop where he had said he would meet Peter. He walked quickly, thinking of Susan and the cinema. Suddenly, a voice shouted, "Hey, you!" John stopped and turned around. It was Susan's boyfriend, Steve. "Where do you think you're going?" Steve said loudly. "It's nothing to do with you," replied John and carried on walking. "Oh, yes, it is," shouted Steve. John could hear feet running up behind him. He didn't turn around. Suddenly, John felt a kick on the back of the leg. He tried to run but fell over instead. He lay on the ground, and as he looked up, he saw that Steve was standing over him. "Now we'll have a little talk," said Steve. "No, we won't," said John, jumping up and pushing Steve away. Then John looked around. Steve wasn't alone. He had 3 friends with him. Steve came up to John and pushed him against the wall. "So," he said, "you want to fight, do you?" As he said each word, he pushed John hard against the wall with his hand. John felt lost. What could he do? There were 4 people against him, and he was in a strange town. "We're going to teach you a lesson," said Steve with a nasty laugh. "We're going to teach you not to try to steal my girlfriend." John began to feel afraid. He knew that he must do something quickly. Suddenly, he hit Steve in the stomach and tried to run away, but the other 3 boys caught him. "So you're frightened, are you?" asked one of the boys. "You can't get away now," said another. "We're going to teach you a lesson," said the third. Then one of the boys hit John hard in the face, and another boy hit him in the stomach. John fell on the ground. He felt sick. Then Steve came up and started to kick him. John was going to scream, "Go away and mind your own business." "No, I won't mind my own business," said Peter, and hit Steve hard, knocking him back against the wall. John, seeing that the others were watching Steve and Peter fight, jumped up and started to run. "This way," shouted Peter. "Get into the car." John ran over to the big black car which was standing by the pavement. As John got in, he looked back to see that Peter had beaten Steve. Steve and his friends were running away. "How did you know I was here?" John asked Peter when he got into the car. "We'll talk about it later," said Peter. John and Peter sat in silence until the car stopped beside Peter's lorry. Peter thanked the driver, and both Peter and John got into the lorry. Peter started the engine and they drove back to Bristol. "Now," said Peter as they were leaving Manchester, "tell me how you got into the fight." John explained to Peter about the cinema, Susan, and Steve. "I hope that fight taught you a lesson," said Peter. "Don't." "Yes, I know," replied John with a laugh. "Don't steal other boys' girlfriends. You sound just like Steve." "But how did you know where I was? You arrived just in time." "I didn't know where you were," replied Peter. "It was just luck. I was in the car on the way back to the lorry when I saw the fight. I asked the driver to stop because it didn't seem to be a fair fight. It was 4 against 1. I didn't recognize you until after I had shouted, 'Stop.'" "That was lucky," said John. "Yes," laughed Peter. "But next time, be more careful. Next time you get into a fight, I may not be there to rescue you." "All right," answered John. "But what happened when you went to see your friends? Were they able to help us?" Peter told John about his visit to the cafe, the meeting with the man with the knife, and the talk with Jeff at the cabaret club. "When can we go and see this man in Bristol, the one Jeff told you about?" asked John. "It depends on when we get back to Bristol," said Peter. "What's the time?" "It's 11 o'clock, John replied. "Well," said Peter, "we should arrive in Bristol at about 5 o'clock in the morning. If we have some sleep after we arrive, we could go and see Bob Steele before lunch." "Won't you have to work tomorrow?" inquired John. Peter shook his head. "No," he said. "Universal Transport don't expect me to drive back until tomorrow, so I needn't go to work tomorrow. We'll have all day tomorrow to find the murderer." It was warm in the lorry. John was tired after his day's excitement, so he soon went to sleep. Peter drove on and on through the night. Halfway to Bristol, they stopped at a cafe and had coffee and some sandwiches. Then they drove on again. The big lorry was empty and so went faster than usual. There were no cars and only a few lorries on the road. They drove faster than Peter had expected, and it was still dark when they arrived in Bristol. "Wake up!" shouted Peter. "We're in Bristol now." John looked out of the window sleepily. Peter stopped the lorry. "You had better come to Bridgewater with me," he said. "It may not be safe for you to stay in Bristol." "No, don't be stupid," replied John. "I can look after myself." "All right," said Peter with a smile. "Do you want to get out here?" "See you at lunchtime," said John, as he got out of the lorry. But before Peter had time to reply, John jumped back into the lorry. "Perhaps you're right," John said. "I'll come to Bridgewater with you." "Why did you change your mind so suddenly?" asked Peter. "Because I saw 2 policemen walking up as I was getting out of the lorry," answered John. John stayed with Peter in Bridgewater. After their tiring night, they both slept well. Peter's mother was surprised to see John, but Peter explained that he was a friend in trouble. He did not explain what the trouble was. Soon after 12 o'clock the next day, they drove back into Bristol. Peter stopped the lorry outside a house close to the river. "I think this is it," he said. He took out the piece of paper which Jeff had given him and looked at the address. "Bob Steele, 12 River Street. Yes, that's right." Number 12. River Street was a small, low house which hadn't been painted for a long time. The windows were dirty and the curtains were drawn. The house looked empty. Peter knocked at the door. There was no answer. Peter knocked again. "I'm coming," shouted a voice. After a couple of minutes, the door opened a few centimeters. "Who is it?" a voice asked. "We want to talk to Bob Steele," Peter replied. "Why?" asked the voice. "We want some information," answered Peter. "Come in then," the voice said. Nodded, and they followed Bob Steele up the stairs and into a small room at the back of the house. Although it was the middle of the day, the curtains were drawn in this room too. The only light came from a small lamp on the table by the bed. The bed was untidy and the sheets were very dirty. The floor of the room was covered in old newspapers. "Sit down," said Bob Steele. Peter and John sat down and were able to look at Bob Steele in the light for the first time. He was middle-aged and quite short. His hair was red and he had a small red beard. He was wearing old clothes but had a big new gold watch on his wrist. "I'm Bob Steele," the man said. "If you want information, you've come to the right person." "We want some information about a murder," said Peter quietly. "Murder?" repeated Bob Steele. "Which murder?" "It was my—" said John quickly. "Wait a minute," Peter said to John. "Let me do the talking." Then Peter turned back to Bob Steele. "We want some information about the murder of a teacher called Stevens. He was killed the night before last." "Yes," said Bob Steele, and then stopped. He looked closely at John. "I've seen your photograph in the newspaper. Aren't you the boy the police are looking for?" Bob Steele asked. "Listen," Peter interrupted. "We came here to ask questions, not to answer them." "Okay," replied Bob Steele. "If you give me a couple of hours, I can find out all you want to know. All I've heard about the murder so far is that Mr. Stevens wasn't killed for money. There must have been some other reason." "That's not much help," said Peter. "Look," said Bob Steele, "I can find out a lot more, but you must give me a little time. Come back after lunch and bring the money." "What money?" exclaimed Peter. "Jeff Beck told us you would help us because you were a friend of his." "Jeff was right," replied Bob Steele. "I will help you, but I want £100 for helping you." Peter stood up. "We'll come back at 2:00, he said. "Come on, John. Let's go." Peter and John left the house and walked down the street. They stopped at a cafe on the corner and went in. "I don't know," said John after they had sat down. "Bob Steele wasn't much help, was he?" "Let's wait and see," said Peter. "But Peter," replied John, "I haven't got £100 to give to Bob Steele." "Neither have I," said Peter. "I've only got £20 on me." John laughed. "I hope that's enough," he said. "It will have to be enough," said Peter. "But do you trust Bob Steele?" asked John. "Do you believe that he will tell us the truth?" "We don't have any choice," Peter said slowly. "We must trust him because he's the only person who can help us." Peter and John had lunch in the cafe and afterwards went back to River Street. Bob Steele was waiting for them. He took them upstairs to the same room. "Right," said Bob Steele when they had sat down. "Have you got the money?" Peter nodded. "Have you got the information?" he asked. Bob Steele smiled. "I'll tell you what I've heard. Mr. Stevens wasn't killed for money. He was killed by someone who knew him. He was killed by someone young." John went red in the face and stood up. "What do you mean by that?" he shouted. "Be quiet," said Peter, "and let Bob Steele finish." John sat down and stared at Bob Steele. "He was killed by someone young," Bob Steele repeated. "He was killed by a boy who knew him." "Is that all?" asked Peter. "Yes," replied Bob Steele. "Now give me the money." "Wait a minute," said Peter firmly. "I'll give you the money when you tell me the name of the murderer." "Give me the money now," said Bob Steele loudly. "Don't give him anything," shouted John. "He's a liar. He's not telling the truth. He wants you to think that I'm the murderer." Bob Steele turned and went up to John angrily. Listen, my boy, he said. You'd better keep quiet unless you want the police to know where you are. You can't frighten me, replied John. Bob Steele turned back to Peter. Now give me the money and get out, he said. I tell you what I'll do, said Peter quietly. I'll give you 20 pounds now, and I'll give you the rest when you tell me the name of the murderer. Bob Steele was quiet for a minute. He looked at John and thought for a moment. He took the money, then he smiled. Okay, said Bob Steele. Let's arrange a place to meet. How about under the clock at the railway station at 3:30? I'll be able to tell you the name then. We'll see you then, said Peter. Peter and John went out together. When they were in the street, Peter turned angrily to John. Why don't you keep quiet? Peter said, turning to John. Bob Steele is our only chance. You shouldn't shout at him or call him a liar. I don't like him, replied John. And anyway, he was trying to make you think that I am the murderer. We'll find out who is the murderer at 3:30, said Peter, and they walked off down the street. Bob Steele watched John and Peter from his window. He waited until they had gone. Then he went downstairs and over to the public telephone box across the street, and at 3:30? I expect he will, said Peter, unless you made him too angry. Do you want to come to the post office with me? No, thanks, answered John. I can look after myself. I'll go straight to the railway station and meet you there. All right, said Peter. Do as you like. See you at the station at 3:30. See you then, said John. Then John walked off down the road towards the river. He watched the ships unloading for a while. Then he walked back up the hill towards the station. He went into the station and sat on a seat. There were lots of people in the station and no one noticed him. He watched the trains come and go. The time passed quickly, and looking at the station clock, John saw to his surprise that it was already 3:30. He couldn't see either Peter or Bob Steele. John got up and walked over to the clock. 5 minutes passed. He began to wonder what had happened. Suddenly, 2 men walked up to him. I wonder what they want, thought John. Perhaps they want to ask the way. John Stevens, the first man said. I am Detective Inspector Shaw. You are under arrest for the murder of your uncle. They were policemen. John looked around to see if he could escape, but the second policeman put his hand on John's shoulder. Don't try to run away, said the policeman. You'd better come with us. The policeman took John outside the railway station, where there was a police car waiting. They put John into the back seat, and Detective Inspector Shaw got in beside him. The other policeman got into the driving seat and started the car. As they were driving off, John looked back at the station and saw Peter looking at the car. Why did you do it? Asked Detective Inspector Shaw. Do what? Replied John. Kill your uncle, said Inspector Shaw. I didn't kill my uncle, said John angrily. Oh, yes, you did, said Inspector Shaw, looking closely at John. We know you did. John did not reply. When the police car arrived at the police station, the policeman took John inside. They put him in a small room with no window and told him to wait there. There was no chair, and John was soon tired of standing, so he sat down on the floor. A few minutes later, Inspector Shaw came in. He saw John sitting on the floor and told him to stand up. John stood up. Are you going to tell us all about the murder now? Asked Inspector Shaw roughly. John didn't reply. He looked at the floor. Look at me, boy, shouted the policeman. John looked up. Now tell me the truth, said Inspector Shaw. Tell me why you killed your uncle. I didn't, started John. I see, interrupted Inspector Shaw. So you want to be difficult, do you? Inspector Shaw went out of the room and banged the door. John sat down again, but as soon as he did so, the door opened and he was told to stand up. After about an hour, another policeman came in, smiled, and said hello to John. "I'm Sergeant Black," he said. "Are you John?" "Yes," John replied. Sergeant Black brought 2 chairs, and he and John sat down. "I expect you're thirsty," said Sergeant Black. "Would you like a cup of tea?" "Yes, please," said John with a smile. He liked this policeman much more than Inspector Shaw. Sergeant Black brought in 2 cups of tea and a plate of cakes. "Now then," said Sergeant Black kindly, "what's all this about?" John didn't reply. "You can trust me," said Sergeant Black. "I'll understand." John liked Sergeant Black and he liked the tea, so he started to answer the sergeant's questions. "Did you like your uncle?" asked the sergeant. "No," said John slowly. "Not very much." "Where have you been for the last 2 days?" asked Sergeant Black. "I've been to—" John stopped. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Black got up and went out. John sat and thought for a minute. "I must be more careful," he thought. "I nearly said that I had been to Manchester. That would get Peter into trouble for helping me." Sergeant Black still hadn't come back, but John could hear his voice. He went up to the door and listened. Sergeant Black was talking to Inspector Shaw. "He's starting to talk now," said Sergeant Black. "Good," replied Inspector Shaw. "He'll tell you everything now." John went back to his chair and sat down. That was lucky, he thought. It had all been a trick to make him talk. Sergeant Black and Inspector Shaw were working together. Sergeant Black came back into the room. "Now," he said with a smile. "Where were we? Oh, yes, you were just telling me that you had been to— I don't remember now. Where was it you said you had been?" "I haven't been anywhere," said John, "and I'm not telling you anything." "Now, don't be stupid," said Sergeant Black. "If you didn't kill your uncle, you haven't got anything to be afraid of, have you? Tell me all about it, and I'll see if I can help you." John said nothing. Sergeant Black tried asking more questions, but John didn't reply. After a while, the sergeant put John in another room with a bed and locked the door. "Can I have some food, please?" John asked. "Yes." Peter ran into the station and looked under the clock, but there was no one there. But where was Bob Steele? Perhaps Bob Steele had already left, or perhaps he had seen the police and run away. Or perhaps Bob Steele had told the police that John would be waiting at the station at 3:30. Peter turned around angrily and left the station. Peter went back to River Street to collect his lorry. He also wanted to talk to Bob Steele again. He wanted to find out if Bob Steele had told the police about John and if he knew anything more about the murder. When Peter arrived at River Street, he was still feeling very angry. Peter banged on the front door of Bob's home, but there was no answer. He waited for a moment and then banged again. There was still no answer. Peter tried to look in the front windows, but he couldn't see anything because the curtains were all closed. He went around to the back of the house and banged on the back door. There was no answer. Right, thought Peter. If Bob Steele is at home, he'll have to go out at some time. If he's out, he'll return home in the end. So I'll wait for him. Peter walked back to the front of the house and drove his lorry around the corner, out of sight. Then Peter went into the cafe on the corner, where he and John had waited at lunchtime. He sat at a table at the window, from which he could watch Bob Steele's front door. It was just after 4 o'clock. Peter drank a cup of tea and waited. By 5 o'clock, Bob Steele still had not appeared. Peter drank another cup of tea and ate some biscuits. At 6 o'clock he went out, bought a newspaper, and returned to the cafe. He looked at the front page of the newspaper. Peter pushed the newspaper away angrily. So it was true. John was under arrest. Peter asked for another cup of tea. At 6:30, he decided not to wait for Bob Steele any longer. He was just leaving the cafe when he suddenly stopped. He could see Bob Steele walking quickly along the street away from number 12. Peter decided to follow him. Bob Steele went towards the center of the town and Peter followed him. When Bob Steele stopped to cross the road, Peter hid in a doorway. When Bob Steele looked around, Peter hid behind his newspaper. After a few minutes, Bob Steele stopped at a bus stop. Peter waited in a shop doorway, pretending to read his newspaper. The bus came and Bob Steele got on. Peter followed and sat close to the door of the bus so that he could watch Bob Steele without being seen. Peter wasn't sure what ticket he should buy, so he asked to go to the center of town and hoped that Bob Steele would get off there. Peter was right. Bob Steele got off at the bus station in the center of the town. Here, it was easier for Peter to follow because there were more people. Soon, Bob Steele turned into a narrow side street. Peter followed him. But when Peter turned the corner, he was surprised to see that the side street was empty.